Thanks very much, Brian. As Brian just said, I manage the team that produces the emission statistics in the EPA, which will include the, can you all hear me? Is this one on? Yeah. Which includes the greenhouse gas inventories and projections. So I guess we've been doing this for quite a while. The EPA has been producing emissions inventory since the early 90s. And I guess sometimes we're not sure whether the message is getting heard because obviously we've given the same story quite a few times over the years. I think today we're confident that we're on a different approach. Today's going to be a day where we're looking at solutions, and so I think people are definitely hearing the message. But I'm just noticing that podium was quite like the one I'm standing at the moment, so hopefully 2019 is not going to be the same. I'll take you through what we have in terms of the impacts and the challenge facing Ireland, both in terms of the targets that we face and also just the natural impacts on the climate and ecosystem, where we're heading in terms of our emissions and where we've come from in terms of our historical emissions and what we can learn from that. And then a little bit again at the end about the Irish targets, our national policy targets and our EU targets and where we're heading in relation to those. So first of all, in terms of global impacts, we're already seeing damaging impacts at 1 degree warming. And you know, as Ed spoke, we've seen an awful lot of fires and so on in the last number of years. So this is happening at the moment. For Ireland, it's expected that we will experience generally wetter winters and drier summers, and this is coming from our research. And we'll also see more extreme events, which we've already seen in the last number of years. And of course, with rising sea level, also the impact of those storms will be more severe. There's a very good report done in 2018 funded by our research team. That's certainly up on our website and probably on the research stand outside if you want to have a look as well, which summarises the state of knowledge as of 2018 in relation to the impacts. And there's quite a lot of research I put up there as well, also in terms of the adaptation levels and preparedness. The Paris Agreement goals to limit warming below 2 degrees require a huge change very quickly. So we're talking about reducing global emissions by 20% on 2010 levels by 2030. To limit to 1.5 degrees, and there's a significant difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of the impacts on the world in general, and Ireland in particular. That's a 45% reduction on 2010 levels by 2030. So I think we just need to keep in mind the scale of the change we're talking about. This is not tinkering at the edges. What Ireland has committed to in response to the Paris Agreement under the EU's effort sharing regulation is a 30% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030 under that regulation, and that refers to the emissions of the non-ETS sector, so the non-emissions traded sector, not power gen, not big industry, but everything else. And then we also have our national ambition, which is to reduce selected CO2 emissions, so built environment, transport and power generation by at least 80% by 2050. And we also have in line with that a carbon neutrality, approach to carbon neutrality in agriculture and land use sector. So what that looks like, just to throw it up there for now, that's the kind of line we're talking about between now and 2050. And I'll come back to this later on when we look at the more detailed sectors. But just keep that trend in mind, that arrow. That's where the emissions need to be going in order to get us where we're looking to go. So the EPA has a huge number of responsibilities in relation to climate. As I say, I've highlighted my own up there, inventories and projections, but we also have the research guys who you've seen upstairs, the climate dialogue guys who've put this together, and also the climate secretariat to the Climate Council. And then in our regulatory role, our emissions trading scheme, we have other additional roles. So it's a big part of what the EPA does. In terms of the emissions inventories and projections, EPA is the lead statutory body, but we don't actually do all this ourselves. Most of the data we get, some of it's internal, but quite a lot of it we get from other departments and agencies. And for example, with the SCI and Shagas, they would provide input in terms of energy forecasts, agriculture number forecasts, and this will all be put together by us in order to produce the national projections and the national inventories. So the highlights from the latest projections and latest inventory, and I'll pick 2017, which We would have just submitted to the UN in April. Agriculture emissions in 2017 increased by 2.9%, which seems like not a huge number, but actually is when you consider the size of agriculture, with over 20 million tonnes in our emissions in total. Transport emissions are down 2.4%, and I put a but on the end of it, unfortunately. This is not a much look for decoupling of emissions and demand, but in fact it's related to Brexit more than anything, because fuel tourism decrease, and this is where people from Northern Ireland largely are buying fuel down south because the exchange rates work in their favour, and exchange rates have gone against them in the last year or so because of the uncertainty. So what's actually driving the emissions down in 2017 in transport is a reduction in fuel tourism, not a reduction in national demand. Energy industry emissions are down 6.9%, and that is a good thing. But I suppose the but here is the cause of it is down to largely Money Point not operating at full capacity, and that's good. But the downside is the main reason for that was price related. So it could go back up and operate at full capacity again just as easily if the price goes the other direction. There's nothing to stop that happening. Now in 2018 we were well aware that there was 3 months of no operation at Money Point due to maintenance. So we'd expect a similar kind of picture for 2018. But again, there's nothing to stop 2019 if it's capable of operating at full capacity, prices are the right direction, then we could see that go back up again. So finally, as a result of all that, we will significantly miss our 20% non-ETS reduction. I haven't put an actual figure on it because we're still working on the projections at the moment. We have a range of numbers in our minds, but it's anywhere from between 1% to 6% depending on fuel prices and the number of measures you take into account, but still a long way off 20% in any event. That's the kind of a gap we have to the 2020 targets. I thought we'd focus in a bit on the emissions per capita because it's a good way of comparing across countries the different levels of emissions when you've got huge different populations. Ireland doesn't come very well out of this, and unfortunately the slide is hidden. Ireland is beside Iceland there, the one with the large orange on top, so the big methane amount. So that's one of the reasons why we're fourth worst as it happens on this, is due to the level of methane from Ireland. But that, even if you take methane out of it, we're still above average in the EU. We're still on the left-hand side of this graph. And I think, just following on from the focus of this conference on leadership, the EPA and Ireland as a general would like us to be leading by example. And I think if we're going to lead by example, we have to be over the right-hand side of this graph. There are reasons why some of those countries might have lower per capita emissions than us, but some of them have big manufacturing industries as well that we don't have. So, swings and roundabouts. It's not impossible for us. Say, for example, Sweden down the right-hand side, which you can't actually see there now. They have less emissions in total than we have, even though double our population. So there are some big differences across Europe. And Denmark, for example, will be the next one after us that have significant methane emissions. So it's not impossible to mitigate. And they're well ahead of us in terms of CO2. Just a quick look at the trend now between 1990 and overall emissions, and just see what's happened. The first step of this, we've got it increased from 1990 to 2000 by 27%, and that was at a time when the economy was growing, population was growing, and there was nothing to decouple emissions growth from those two things, and that's what happened. Emissions went up. The period from 2002 to 2014 is kind of a game of two halves. The first part, we did actually see some decoupling because demand and growth continued in the early 2000s, and yet emissions declined. And that's largely due to energy generation, where we did see some decoupling of emissions with more renewables on stream and more efficient plants particularly. As the recession hit in 2008, 2009, we saw big drops, and particularly in transport. We'll see that later on, we're hit by the recession. But since then, since 2014, we've seen increases year on year, and this is because we haven't actually fully decoupled growth from emissions, and they're continuing to rise. The projections on this graph are quite best case scenario. These include the measures that were announced last year in the National Development Plan, and they also are worked on the basis of a relatively high fuel price. So if the fuel prices turn out lower than expected, those emissions could be considerably higher. And again, this is when I say focus back on the graph I started with the arrow going down the right. That's the line we need to see. And the flat line isn't. It mightn't seem like it's not terrible, but it's not solving the problem. It's keeping us where we are, and we need to actually reduce emissions. So the projection here is a decrease, sorry, to 2040, but that's not, as I say, that's a best case scenario on this one. Looking at where the emissions come from, so I didn't go into the full split there, but we've got about a third of the emissions from agriculture, a fifth from transport, similar amount from energy, and about 10% from residential. And the rest then is made up of things like F-gases, manufacturing, which is quite small in Ireland, commercial and industry, commercial and public services, I should say. Manufacturing is increasing at the moment because the cement industry will be in there, but in general terms, it's smaller compared to the transport or energy or agriculture sectors. And what's happening, we're at about 60 million tonnes in 2017. What's happening there is that we're increasing on the two big sectors. So the two big sectors are increasing in their share. Agriculture will increase its share to nearly 38%, and transport will go up to 22%. So that's worrying because we're looking at the big sectors responsible for the biggest amount of emissions are the ones that are continuing to increase, and that makes it much more difficult for us to mitigate. So let's go into the agriculture then to start with. You can see that the blue and red in this is related to cows or cattle, and the green is related to fertilizer. So they're the two big things. Dairy industry has gone up substantially. So we've had, I think it was 26% between 2012 and 2017 of an increase in the dairy cow herd. So we're seeing from 2010 up until from 2012 to 2017 and continued growth outwards. And actually from that point right now we're just about slightly below the 1990 levels. So the peak, as you can see, was in 1998, but we're on the way back up again now. And it's largely related to animal numbers, but also fertilizer as well. And the 2018 numbers would suggest that we're going to see a continued increase. We haven't got any accurate numbers on it yet, but the early fertilizer estimates and agriculture estimates would suggest that this isn't going to change anytime soon. I would say the projections in this are, again, conservative in terms of animal numbers. So the risks to the emissions there are probably more on the upside because we've seen emissions in the last number of years go ahead of what the projections were suggesting. So I think this is, again, it's not projections are always choosing one scenario. So I think you have to bear the upside risks in mind. Now, the other thing, again, about agriculture, supposing we talked about the national policy position at the start. We were looking at neutrality in agriculture and land use, and Ed talked about it as well, and so did the minister. The level of, and this came from the audience about the level of planting. The level of planting projected at around 12,000 hectares a year, that's the level of sequestration we might see from that, around 7.5 million tonnes. And that doesn't quite get to, it's not even half of what emissions we have from agriculture. So I think, although we haven't fully defined exactly what the approach to neutrality in agriculture and land use means, it does have to bear some resemblance to what the sink capacity is. So it's clear that there's a huge need for additional sequestration if neutrality is to be met, or a significant reduction in emissions if that target is to be achieved. Transport emissions are one of the most challenging because they have always been and continue to be closely coupled with economic activity. So for the first period in this, up until 2007, if you put that line up against employment growth or economic growth, it would look a very similar shape. And similarly, when we went into the recession post-2008, the transport emissions declined in tandem with employment declines and in tandem with economic decline. I couldn't actually put up the GDP graph here because there's been some changes in how not changes in how GDP are calculated, but in how GDP is calculated, the impact of foreign industries and so on makes it very difficult to use it as a predictor. But things like employment are still very closely correlated with transport emissions. Again, as I said, this is a best case scenario at the moment where we're seeing a 1.2% decrease to 2030 from now. That's on using fairly high fuel prices, and transport is the sector that is most impacted by fuel prices. So if we, and also I should say that also includes 500,000 electric vehicles in 2030. So there is an impact of that mitigation in there that was announced last year in the National Development Plan. The impact of the EVs would, without the EVs, would probably bring us up to about there. So the impact of the EVs isn't huge. But if we use the lower fuel prices that projections from, say, the UK Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, which we would have used in the past, it's a reputable agency, we're talking about emissions that will go up this far, up over 20, that's about 36% up on where we are now. So there's a huge variation possible here, depending on what fuel prices we use. And I think when we're looking at mitigation, we need to be aware of that and conservative in our approach. Energy industries is more complicated in that we, as I said, the overall emissions were driven by some element of decoupling in energy, particularly from 2001 to 2008, where we saw a decline, which you wouldn't have seen in transport. And that was largely down to shutting down old peat plants. Sorry to say the overall decrease. Shutting down old peat plants and conversion from oil as well to higher efficiency gas plants, but also the increase in renewables on the grid, which are at times up around 30%. It's just below 30%, I think, on an annual basis at the moment for wind energy. So yeah, I mean, that's having a huge impact. But I think when we look out to the future, despite these measures here, or these projections including additional renewables, there is a gradual increasing trend in the emissions up until Money Point is projected to move away from coal in 2025. So the big impact there where it falls off the cliff, and that is a projected end of coal at Money Point. But other than that, if you look at the trend both before and after that point, it's still gradually increasing, and that's despite there being continued increase in the number of renewables on the grid. So the amount of renewables in the National Development Plan measures last year doesn't quite keep pace with demand. So I think this is another case where in the new plan, hopefully we'll see additional measures that will help to bring the emissions downwards to that red line that we started off with. Residential emissions are about 10% overall. Well, this is an interesting case because the emissions, if you look at the red line, is the overall emissions. They've declined substantially, 23.7% since 1990 to 2017. I'm not showing the projection here because it's kind of more useful to actually just look at what's happened. And that's despite we've gone from 1 million households in 1990 to 1.7 million households in 2017. So there's a big increase in demand here. And yet the emissions have gone down. And really, you can see it on the graph, solid fuels decreased by 3/4, 75% decrease, liquid and gas has more than doubled. And that's a hugely more efficient source of heating. So that's what's actually happened. Even though we've gotten not far off double the number of households, we're still actually using less energy. In the future, what we expect to see in residential would be more efficiency measures and more electrification of heating. And hopefully we'll continue this downward trend. But again, the projections do include population growth, continued population growth as well. So it does have to overcome that. It's not just about overcoming where we are now, it's about overcoming the projected growth in population as well. Just moving on to our breakdown of our non-ETS emissions, because this is what's covered by the EU targets. So agriculture and transport are over 3/4 of those. Energy isn't highly relevant here because most of that is in the emissions trading sector. Residential is a big part of it as well, though, and some smaller industry and commercials. Where we are in terms of compliance for 2030, the dotted line at the bottom is at 30% below the 2005 level, which is what we've agreed to under the effort sharing regulation. The two lines above, the green line is our existing measures, projections, and the additional measures, including what was in the National Development Plan last year, is the purple line. So there's a significant gap remaining. I think that's the main point. I wouldn't put actual numbers on this yet because we're still working on these projections, as I say, and there's a number of scenarios in it. But we are seeing that there is a significant gap remaining that the All Government Plan will have to tackle. And so there is flexibilities and other caveats around this, which we can talk about again. But for now, I think that's the main point. There's still a significant gap remaining. And finally, looking at the policy position, so this is filling out the graph we had earlier. If we were to move from where we are now to the 5 million tonne target, we're talking about just under 1 million tonnes a year of mitigation needed. With these, as I say, best case projections, we look at 2030, we're talking about 1.2 million tonnes a year. If we get to that point before we start acting, if we don't act until we get to 2040, we're looking at 2.4 million tonnes a year. And looking back at the numbers we saw even in the recession, we didn't see drops like that except for 1 year in the recession. So that's the kind of shock that would be to bring in those levels of decreases. I think only 2009 was higher than that. So that's what it means if we don't act quickly in terms of the impact on the economy. So in conclusion, the current and planned policies and measures as of the National Development Plan last year, I emphasise we haven't obviously gotten the all-of-government plan in this because it's not out yet, are not sufficient to meet the current or the future targets. We're projected to significantly exceed the carbon budget for 21 to 30, even with flexibilities. And again, with fuel prices considered, I think a more conservative approach would be recommended. Agriculture and transport sectors dominate the emission increases. They're the biggest sectors and the hardest to mitigate, it would seem. So we're not on track towards decarbonisation in the long term at the moment, and hopefully that's something that this session will address. So just finishing up with the key message from the IPCC, there's a big difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees and 1.5 degrees even. We're already seeing impacts at 1 degree, so every degree matters. Every year matters because it gets more difficult as we go along, and every choice matters. If we make choices now that lock us into things in the future that are not helping us to solve our climate problem, then we're making the wrong choices. Just looking at, finally, to give you some information, we have all this information up on our website, and we will be putting the new projections up there in the next week or so. We're also working on a new method of getting this information out there, which we welcome your feedback on, and we'll send this around in the link, in a link with the post-conference, just to give you a look at it. This is a new portal which will give you information on all the different sectors, the projections and inventories by gas, and all our documents and reports in one easy-to-find place. So I say it's a new thing we've built only in the last number of months, and we'll be delighted to hear your feedback on that and if it's meeting your needs. So thank you very much.